Hi, folks. Thanks for joining today and today's webinar. This is webinar number 5 in our Stay Connected weekly webinar series here at Aruba, a Hewlett-Packard Enterprise company. My name is Anthony. I manage the webinar program and appreciate you taking the time to join us for today's topic. Today's topic being security, network security, and the title, Your Users Have Left the Building, Extending Security Best Practices to Remote Workers. Before I introduce Paul Caspian, I'd like to let you know a couple of things. First of all, our usual webinar series was a bi-weekly series. In the last probably month or so, a little over a month, we've gone to a weekly webinar series, this Stay Connected. And we kicked things off 5 weeks ago with how your network can deliver business continuity to you and your employees. Over the last 4 weeks, we've talked about healthcare industry, education, higher ed and K-12, virtual call centers, and the retail industry, and how all of those businesses are facing these challenges, how they're handling the challenges, and how their networks, business networks, can help them adapt to meeting these new challenges. We're joined today by Paul Caspian, Senior Product Manager, Enterprise Security at Aruba. Keeping your network secure and keeping your remote employees secure when they're on the network is key. That's the topic today, and Paul's going to give us some tips on how to do that. Before we get to today's webinar, a couple of notes for those who are using our BrightTalk webinar platform for the first time. It's not Aruba's BrightTalk platform, but it's the one we use to deliver these. First, there's a box underneath the slide window to ask questions. You can submit them. Please ask the questions throughout the webinar, and we'll save the questions for the end and answer them in the order they came in. If we don't get to all the questions, or we don't have an answer, we don't have the answers for all the questions, we'll follow up with you directly using the email you used to register. Also, at the end, feedback. Over the course of 3 years of doing these webinars, we have drastically changed the way we deliver them, the amount of content that's in them, how much time we allot for content versus Q&A, and a few other things. So please, you'll be prompted to give some feedback at the end. There's a 1 to 5 star rating. Please give us what you feel we deserve, and any comments on how you feel we did or what we could improve, or if you just want to say, hey, great job, that's fine too. We get all of them. Also, there's a link or an area for attachments and links that we have provided related to today's topic in the attachments and links section. So with that, let's go ahead and turn it over to you, Paul. I've had a chance to work with Paul on a number of different projects. We're lucky to have him today. He's extremely busy, as we know you are as well, so we think it'll be a good marriage. And Paul, go ahead and take him away.
Hey, thanks, Anthony. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks so much for joining us today. I know we're in an unprecedented time right now, and we have a lot of unique challenges that we're all dealing with, both personally and professionally, so I appreciate your time today. This topic obviously is all the more relevant as many of us are working from home and also helping others, enabling others to work from home. So I'm going to be focusing on sort of the themes around connectivity and also what some of the security implications are around that today. I spent the majority of my career in enterprise security. I've been at Aruba for several years now, and I'm responsible for our enterprise security offerings, including our ClearPass family of solutions. So just to kind of kick things off, I thought this quote was really relevant from NIST that I found around telework, and I think this really speaks to sort of the high-level challenge. When we think about as people move to a remote format and as people start working remotely and as we start enabling more and more folks to do that, whether they're working from home, whether they're working on the go and things like that, in essence, as more people leave the office, I kind of joked a bit on the title about your users have left the building, but as more and more folks branch out and leave the office, work from home, work from remote sites, if we look at that just from a security standpoint, it really opens us up to a number of different risks. And that's simply because we don't have as much control over those users. We don't have as much control over those devices. And if we look at it from a very high level around security, we have kind of a larger attack surface that we're dealing with. And that's why when you look at NIST, and I've actually included a couple of links to some of their guidance around remote connectivity and security. If you look at their guidance, it really speaks to this and sort of this high-level risk is as more people move outside, our risk goes up. And so some of the themes I'll touch on today in the webinar are really how do you extend connectivity to your users and how do you do it in a way that makes sense, for your organization and your infrastructure? And then how do you employ some industry best practices to ensure that you're applying the right security controls to those users as they move out of the building, so to speak? So I'll start out with kind of, if you look at the three main areas of this, when we kind of break it down to remote workers, one is really providing just the initial access, right? How do we provide that connectivity? What are some of the challenges there, and what are the best practices? How do we give them great experiences, right? A lot of our users expect that when they're working from home, they have all the same access that they had previously, that they have basically an experience that's very similar to what they would experience in the office, right? So one question is really, how do we extend that that connectivity to their home in a way that they would feel exactly the same when they're in the office? And then finally, how do we apply security best practices? How do we apply access controls to folks coming in via the VPN so that we follow good guidelines, like segmenting different users from other users, providing sort of least access to resources and things like that. So I'm going to kind of touch on those three themes throughout the presentation. And I'll kind of start out first with really the connectivity side of things. As Aruba, this has been something we've typically been very strong in. But if you look at this kind of challenge, and I kind of broke it down, in the previous slide, but how do we address this explosive growth in users, right, that are working remotely, more so now than ever? And then how do we apply security to that? And the reason I kind of call each of these areas out in terms of these pillars is that they kind of sometimes are kind of opposing forces, so to speak, right? So a lot of times we want to open up access, we want to open up connectivity. Sometimes people think we have to compromise from a security standpoint, right? And in a lot of cases that isn't the case. You can provide those great experiences, provide that access, and still put controls in place that are really seamless, and really something that the users don't see, but are going to dramatically, sort of reduce your risk, related to these folks connecting remotely. So those are the things that we can do, and they don't have to be opposing forces. They can be things that we can implement, in parallel, and provide those good experiences and that security that we need. So from just a sheer connectivity standpoint, right, when we just look at providing this access, as I mentioned, this is something that Aruba's done really well for a long time, and you can think of sort of the access. I'm sure many of you are already using a lot of these capabilities. You can think of this access as sort of two sides, and that is really the sort of the gateway side of things, where folks are connecting to, right, and then also how they're connecting, where they're connecting from. And before I get into sort of how Aruba does this and some of the options that exist within our portfolio, and maybe actually for a lot of you out there that already have Aruba infrastructure, you probably have these capabilities today, and maybe you're not using them currently, or you're only using a portion of them. So hopefully this will give you some additional insight into what you may already have and how you can kind of take advantage of that. So before I kind of get into that, I want to do a brief poll, and I'm going to go ahead and issue that right now. And the question really is, what's your primary focus related to remote workers at the moment? I want to get kind of a flavor for the folks on the phone where you're really focused. So I'm going to go ahead and kick off voting, and we're going to give that just a couple of minutes for you to respond and get some insight into sort of what your priorities are. And then I'll get into a little bit about
how Paul, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, so go ahead and do the poll. Yeah, we'll go ahead and do the poll. We have two polls that we're going to present here. One obviously is coming up now, and one a little bit later in the presentation. So while Paul puts that together, and I see the poll is now showing up, so thanks for doing that. Go ahead and take some time to answer the question, what is your primary focus related to remote workers at the moment? You can find the poll below the tabs underneath the slide screen. Also, ask your questions. I just put a note up for everyone to see directly below the slide on the screen that you can ask your questions throughout, and we will answer them in the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. Paul, back to you.
Okay, perfect. So thanks, folks. I'm just seeing some votes coming in now. I'll give it about another 30 seconds here or so to give you guys some additional time to vote. Looks like right now there's a bit of a tie between increasing capacity and addressing security. So it looks like we're on the right track here with sort of the topics around both connectivity and also around security. All right, I'll stop.
And more votes coming in. Yeah, we got more votes coming in right at the end. So that's changed it just a little bit to kind of more of the all of the above, right?
Looks like it. Yeah, looks like it. Okay. Well, thanks, folks, for taking a second to do that. I'll go ahead and stop the voting. If you're in the process, I'll give you a couple more seconds here. All right. So we'll just to kind of take a quick look at the results before we move on. The question again was, what's your primary focus related to remote workers at the moment, right? The first option was increasing capacity, right, of my existing solution. One was ensuring user experiences. The last was addressing security risks. And the fourth answer was all of the above. And all of the above won out by far. 70% of you said that you're really focused on increasing capacity, making sure those users have great experiences, and then addressing security. And security was actually a close second here. So it looks like, from what we're going to be talking about today, this should address a lot of the things that you're sort of focused on at the moment. So with that, Anthony, any other comments before I move on into some of the Aruba remote access solutions?
No, I think we're good. Continue on, and folks, there will be another poll coming up in a little bit, so be ready for that one.
Yeah, perfect, Anthony. Thank you. So as I was mentioning before the poll, from a connectivity standpoint, this is something Aruba's done for a long time, and I kind of mentioned there were two sides of this, right? There's sort of the VPN gateway aspect of this, where folks are connecting to, and there's also the sort of how they're connecting, right? And the one thing I wanted to point out is that you probably have users that have different needs, right? Some users are, road warriors, and they're on the road a lot. They're connecting from their mobile devices. And you have other users that are, maybe they're work remote, work from home 100% of the time, as an example, right? And so from the Aruba standpoint, we can provide solutions that are tailored to those kind of different personas within your organization. So for those road warriors or connecting from their mobile devices, something like a VPN client with VIA is a really appropriate solution for them. And you can actually mix and match these for users that are in different kind of environments when they're working. We also have things like our remote access points, or our RAPs as we call them, that are excellent for employees that are fairly stationary but remote. So as an example, I work remotely from my home office 100% of the time. So using something like a RAP basically gives me and anybody else access to all the things we would normally sort of access in the office, and it gives us a very similar experience. In fact, when you're using a RAP in your home office, it looks exactly like you're sitting in Aruba HQ in Santa Clara. So I see the same wireless networks. It'll audio associate. I can plug devices in or use other types of devices, and they'll be instantly connected. So from sort of an experience standpoint and kind of this always-on sort of goal, the RAPs provide a really good solution for that. So I just wanted to kind of point out that there's a variety of ways that users can connect to the Aruba infrastructure remotely. And as I mentioned, many of you will have those through your existing controllers and gateways have this capability to extend VPN connectivity. And we can do that via the hardware. We can do that via virtual gateways. There are a lot of different options. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on those specifically, but I just wanted to kind of point out that this is sort of the spectrum of ways that you can help connect remote users. That VIA client on the right side in terms of the VPN client, those remote APs or RAPs as we call them as well. And this is also some detail on sort of the differences if we kind of go down a level, a software solution with VIA that's deployed on the endpoint versus some of the different hardware options that give some pretty significant advantages in terms of, like I said, user experiences, having that always-on connection back to the corporate intranet, and also some ease-of-use features around things like ZTP or Zero Trust Provisioning. So whether you decide to go with a software client or a hardware component, these are very, very easy ways and very quick ways to get users connected back pretty seamlessly, that they can just kind of go about what they normally do, and they won't really see kind of what's happening in the background from their perspective. I wanted to kind of also point out a little bit about sort of the guidance around some of these things. A lot of you on the phone may have some remote workers, but the number of remote workers that you're sort of supporting or you're enabling has probably changed significantly, and even prior to the big uptick that we've had as a result of some of the challenges we've been having lately. So I wanted to point you to a couple of resources. Anthony talked about some of the attachments and links that we have. I would really encourage you to take a look at those. One of the things I want to do in this webinar, besides educate you on some of the things Aruba can offer you and help you with, is also some industry best practices. So NIST is a great example of an industry, a government agency that provides some great guidance on remote access security threats, different methods of creating up a remote access architecture. It also talks about the importance of things like authentication, authorization, and access control. And that's something that I'm going to be talking about here in a couple of minutes. So there's some great guidance on this that I've posted in the attachments links. One is a current bulletin where that quote came from around some of the increased risks as people move outside of the office. And there's also a document here that I'm referring to that essentially gives you a really nice breakdown of the different options for remote access, some of the security considerations, how to set that up, and also how to apply best practices in terms of security. So if you're looking to kind of get more educated on the security aspects of remote connectivity, as it looks like many of you were from the poll that we just ran, I would really encourage you to take a look at this document and get more familiar. Many of you on the phone have probably also heard about this concept in security of zero trust, and I just wanted to mention that for a minute. Zero trust is a really broad category, and a lot of times when we talk zero trust, we're thinking about things more like application security, like how do we protect users connecting to applications, how do we encrypt those sessions, things like that. But zero trust is actually a really good philosophy for security, and it mandates a couple of different things. It says things like users should have least access. And then what that means is that for myself, Paul, in marketing, I should have access to just the tools that I need and the network resources that I need to do my job, and really nothing beyond that. So that's kind of a good tenet of security in general. It also says things like, when we can, we should use things like MFA, multi-factor authentication. We should force re-authentication, at different points when users are accessing different resources on the network. We should take context into account, right? So instead of just relying just on a username and a password, or even a username and multi-factor, we should look at, is that endpoint healthy? What is the context around this connection to the network? And that really equals better security. So posture and endpoint health, things like that are really important when we think of things like remote connectivity and how we're going to actually secure those connections coming into the network. So before I get into a little bit about ClearPass and talk about some of these best practices and how Aruba can help you with those, how you can apply access control to those VPN users that are coming into the network, we're going to do one more poll and get a sense of where you're at on a little bit of a different topic.
Hey, Paul.
Yes.
So while you set up the poll, thanks for the questions so far. There's more time to ask your questions. Once again, if you joined a little bit late, as I can see some of you have, we will be answering questions at the near the end of the webinar. So go ahead and ask them, and we'll take them in the order in which they were received, or we received them. And for any questions that we are unable to answer, thinking that we can answer all of your questions, I think is a bit naive. And we will get the answer for you and come back to you using the email address that you used when you registered. So it looks like the poll is up. Which security risk are you the most concerned about related to remote workers? So back to you, Paul.
Thanks, Anthony. Yeah, so in the first part, we talked a little bit about the basic kind of connectivity requirements, right, and sort of how Aruba can help with that. And we got a flavor for those of you on the webinar what you're thinking about. And as kind of expected, security is a big component of that, right? And I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes talking about best practices around security. How do you apply those best practices to these remote users that are coming in, and really how ClearPass can help you kind of accomplish some of those goals. Looks like we've got a good amount of folks that are responding to the poll. I'll just kind of summarize it quickly. So which security risk are you the most concerned about related to remote workers, right? And we've got a couple different categories. We have malware, spreading through the network, insider attacks, credential theft, or even just a general lack of control. One of the challenges of remote employees or remote workers is that a lot of security professionals and network professionals feel like they really don't have as much control over those users, over their workstations, over their devices. And that can be a pretty considerable challenge. So I'll give the poll just another 30 seconds or so. If you're in the process of voting, go ahead and wrap that up, and we'll kind of summarize the results here. Hey, Paul, while we wait for those results to come in, I have a question for you.
It seems maybe, again, naive for me to think that every company would require a VPN access or VPN to get into the corporate network. Is it possible for some companies or some remote users to get, I don't know, access to network content or data without VPNing?
Yeah, in fact, that's been something that's changed, that's a great question, actually. That's something that's changed over the last several years. I think several years ago, you saw VPN as being kind of the only way of really kind of going into the corporate intranet, so to speak, right? And that's changed because a lot of our applications have moved out of our data center. A lot of them are cloud-based, and many of us use cloud-based applications on a daily basis now. So we have more of a mix. We have stuff that's sort of on the company intranet, and we have things that are obviously in the cloud. And so the way that we work and the way that we sort of the applications we have access to have changed, and there's a lot of different options nowadays. VPN is one of the most obvious sort of ways, traditional ways of connecting remote users to a lot of the corporate applications that they use in addition to their cloud applications. But with things like zero trust network access and things like that, there's more flexibility, so to speak, in how you can open up certain applications to remote users and things like that. So I wouldn't say VPN is the only way. It's been the most traditional way, and I think we're seeing a lot of customers that are adopting an approach where they use some of those traditional connectivity methods in combination with other access options as well.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
And I'm going to go ahead and stop the voting as well now. Looks like most folks have responded. And just to summarize, so we had 54% of you say that malware infections were actually the most significant in how they spread through the network. The next there was 27% around general lack of control, right? And that's something that is, as I kind of mentioned, is a significant challenge as you have more folks move into a remote work role. And then tied for kind of third place was insider threats and attacks at 9% and credential theft at 9%. And the reason I focused on this poll is that it really speaks to some of the kind of the risks that we're sort of experiencing with work remote. And no coincidence, a lot of these can be mitigated through things like network segmentation, access control, strong authentication, things like that. They can really help if someone is infected with malware. Being able to detect that before they actually connect to the network is obviously ideal. But once they connect to the network, if there is an infection, being able to keep that infection from moving throughout the network using things like network segmentation is really important. And so some of the things I'm about to talk to you about around ClearPass and some of those capabilities can really help mitigate some of these risks that you sort of responded to in the poll. So with that, I'll move into a bit about ClearPass. ClearPass is essentially a network access control solution. It provides visibility to who and what is connecting to the network. And it has a very powerful policy engine that essentially can handle everything around AAA. So authentication of users, some of those best practices around enforcing multi-factor authentication, creating policies that can force re-authentication, right? So have them re-authenticate at different strategic points in the network. Being able to essentially create granular policies that will segment those different types of users on the network. And the unique thing about ClearPass is that using this sort of role-based access control, that single policy will relate to that user no matter where they're connecting from. So, as part of today's webinar, we're talking about people coming in remotely, right, via VPN. But once you define that policy for those users in different areas of your organization, whether they're in sales or they're marketing or they're in development, once they have that role-based access profile, that will apply to them whether they're plugging into a wired port, whether they're joining Wi-Fi, at corporate HQ, or whether they're coming in through a VPN connection from their home office. And that's a really nice kind of feature of ClearPass. It gives you that single policy that's going to be applied no matter where they're sort of connecting from. It also has the ability to do that posture assessment capability we talked about. So being able to check that endpoint, when that user is coming in to connect, being able to check that endpoint to make sure that it has anti-malware software installed, that it has the proper security controls installed before they actually connect to the network. That's one of the key capabilities of ClearPass as well. And so what you get once you apply these sort of role-based access control policies is you essentially get that segmentation on the network. We call it dynamic segmentation. So segmenting users as they join the corporate network. And you can, in a very granular way, control applications they have access to, network segments they have access to, and really have really kind of a universal level of control for that particular type of user wherever they're connecting from. So when they come in through a VPN connection, that policy, that security policy, and that segmentation will be automatically applied to that user each time that they connect. So that really accomplishes one of those best practices we're talking about around least access, right? Whether you're looking at best practices around zero trust, which is something that's a very hot topic in security right now, or you're looking at guidelines from NIST. When you dig into some of those documents that I've added in the attachments section, you're going to see these as sort of general security best practices. And quite frankly, if you have users connecting remotely and you've kind of figured out sort of the connectivity options using some of the Aruba infrastructure, just applying strong authentication, multi-factor, and then applying a role-based access control policy, just those couple of steps can really dramatically reduce the risk from those users coming in. So this is really, from a security standpoint, can be very impactful. One thing that we're able to do too with ClearPass, I talked about context, right? If you look at Zero Trust, it talks about being context aware and taking context into account. ClearPass has a very powerful policy engine that can do things like, say, if I have a user that's on their corporate laptop, on the corporate network, they have a certain amount of access. But if I'm connecting from Starbucks or another network on my Android phone, my own personal device as an example, I might want to restrict that access slightly, right? Because I'm on a device that maybe I have less control over from an IT standpoint that could pose an additional security risk, and I may want to restrict that access slightly based on that. And you really want to make those decisions based on your particular organization and sort of their business needs and access needs. But you can do that. You can change the access based on the context of what device the user's on, where they're connecting from, and different things like that to sort of mitigate risk. And that's a really important point around some of the capabilities around ClearPass as well. Now, that's just one way of sort of the kind of the basic level of doing just essential posture assessment and also doing being able to kind of act on context. But one thing I wanted to point out is that since ClearPass has this ecosystem of partners, in fact, we integrate with over 150 different tools, many of which you probably already have, we can do some really unique things there as well in terms of how intelligent we sort of approach this access control and what we do as users come into the network, whether they're on-site, whether they're coming in remotely and things like that. And examples of that would be if you look under the security pillar, since we integrate with all of the sort of leading endpoint security vendors, folks on the call might be using things like CrowdStrike or Carbon Black or things like that on the endpoint. We can actually check, is that software installed? Has it been recently updated? Is this endpoint in a state that I feel confident that I should provide them access to the network? So we can use telemetry from security tools you may already be using to make better access control and apply more security rigor as those remote users are connecting to some of your trusted resources. A couple of other interesting use cases you might want to check out is if you're using things like ServiceNow on the help desk. Wouldn't it be cool if a remote user was potentially quarantined or they had reduced access because maybe they didn't have the proper security software installed? Wouldn't it be cool if we could automatically just open a help desk ticket for that user with, hey, I've had reduced access because of a security policy violation? We can do that with ClearPass. So just as ClearPass can check to make sure that those security controls are in place, in the case that they're not, we can modify access, we can enforce that policy, and we can coordinate with tools like ServiceNow to automatically issue a help desk ticket, plug in what the actual subject was of it, related to the access, control change and things like that. So the automation orchestration capabilities from ClearPass are really powerful. And this is a abbreviated list of some of the other solutions that we can integrate with to really help kind of eliminate some of the manual tasks that you may have and some of the manual headaches you may have from a lot more users connecting remotely. Just a kind of an example of this, I gave you a couple examples of this, but just this might kind of help bring it home a little bit. For ClearPass can essentially kind of have a bidirectional communication. So it can take telemetry from tools that you're using on the endpoint or network security tools and use that telemetry to make better access control decisions, right? We kind of gave some examples of that, looking at the endpoint software, making sure it was current, things like that prior to allowing access. It can also enrich tools you're using. So if you're using a SIM as an example or using network monitoring tools, and you'd really love to have better kind of insight into the authentication behavior on the network, right? ClearPass captures all that. Since it's the main sort of broker for doing all the AAA and authentication, it has all of that context and that insight, and you can actually send that information to tools that you're already using for doing those network monitoring tasks or security monitoring. So by using our API within ClearPass, there's this bidirectional information sharing, and it really creates some powerful use cases, some of the ones that I've actually talked about. So hopefully that gave you a brief kind of overview of connectivity options for Aruba, how to get those remote users connected, how to extend connectivity to folks that maybe are working from home for the first time. I pointed you to some resources to maybe get a little bit sort of more educated on best practices around remote work and securing remote work, and also gave you some examples of how ClearPass uses these kind of powerful access control and authentication capabilities to apply an additional amount of security to those users that are now coming in remotely to the network, around posture assessment, around dynamic segmentation, network segmentation, and some of those best practices. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Anthony. I think we have some questions, and we'll try to get through as many as possible as we can on the call.
Yeah, for sure. So, Paul, go ahead and look in at some of the questions. You have access to see them as well. There's a few in there that we would probably want to start with, but just a quick reminder to folks, ask your questions. There's a tab underneath the slide window, Ask a Question. Go ahead and click that, type in your question, and submit it. Some of you have done that already. Also, coming up at the end, I'll be connecting you to other topics around our Stay Connected Business Continuity series, which started at the end of March, and we are currently on I think this is our 6th one, Paul. So we look forward to you not only joining us today, but checking out some of that content. I'll remind you where that is when we close. But you see, I'll let you cherry pick, Paul. You see any questions in there that you like?
Yeah, actually, there's several good ones. So thanks for your questions. I appreciate it. The first, I'll kind of take them one at a time here. One is, with this solution, you're talking about work for education in the education field. Like as an example, a school district was the example given in the question. And the answer is yes, it would. In fact, we have a lot of customers in education that use Aruba infrastructure very extensively, actually, but also ClearPass that I spoke about. And some of the use cases there would be, obviously, as more teachers are getting online, obviously on campus, as more students definitely are being online and using Wi-Fi and things like that, you really want a way to segment the student population from the faculty population as a perfect example. And we also see a big need for this in higher education. It gets even more pervasive because as you have university students, they're bringing all kinds of different IoT devices to the campus. They want, to plug all these different devices in. And so a lot of the higher ed folks that are, trying to provide good experiences for faculty and staff and also students, it can be really challenging. So ClearPass helps do things like guest access. It helps you delineate those faculty users versus your student body and things like that. So absolutely, very relevant in education. Another question was...
Paul, sorry.
Yeah.
Before you get to the next question, I do want to add, I did mention that we have the Stay Connected webinar series. There was an education, higher ed K-12 specific webinar we did not long ago that is available on demand. So when we finish, I will let folks know where to find that. And if they keep going back to that page, they will see which webinars we have upcoming as well. So all these are available on demand when we're finished, and you can see which ones are coming up. So sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, great point. Next question was around user experience. So the question was, hey, what's the difference between, say, a VPN client like VIA and connecting via remote AP? Is it a lot better? Is it about the same? The basic way to kind of explain that is with a remote client like VIA, every time I connect to the network, I need to launch VIA and connect, obviously, via the software client. And that's not a huge lift for users. It's really easy. We use it at Aruba. It isn't a big lift. But from an experience standpoint, this is a really good point in this question that I kind of mentioned that RAPs, the remote access points, give users this sort of seamless office experience. I think that's the big difference. So although VIA is very easy to use, it's a software client, if a user has deployed a RAP in their home office, it feels just like they walk through the doors of HQ in terms of how the network looks, how the network access is applied. Their experience is going to feel almost identical to when they are actually, at HQ. And so I think that if I had to spell out sort of the biggest difference between, saying, using a client for access or using a wrap for access. The wrap is going to provide kind of an always-on connection, a very seamless experience. It's going to feel just like they do when they're actually at HQ, and that's the difference. But for folks that are on the road all the time, that aren't stationary, that aren't going to pack an access point in their suitcase, they're going to want to use something like VIA. So that's kind of the breakdown. The next question was, hey, I'm using ClearPass today. Do I need additional licenses to integrate with some of the tools that I talked about in the webinar, like ServiceNow? And the answer is no. There's no additional license for those integrations. So we showed, the different 150 different tools that you have access to as a ClearPass customer, and I'm kind of going back and showing those again. And with a base ClearPass license, you have access to integrate any of those solutions with the ClearPass API. So hopefully that answers your question. And then moving along, another question we had. This is a really good mix.
Google threat research reports, you'll see resources from a lot of different folks, and they all publish some very, very good information. So I like NIST. It's a government organization, and it provides a really wide range of different topics and guidance. But there's a lot of good guidance from a lot of the networking and security companies like Aruba out there that do research on these topics and publish it regularly. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. I think that's most of our questions so far. And we'll see if a couple more come in here. Anthony, can you hear me? Anthony, can you hear me? Can folks on the phone hear me? Anthony, can you hear me?
Hey, are you there, Paul?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Sorry about that. We had a little bit of a hiccup there, but you can hear me okay?
I can.
Awesome. Okay. I think we went through the questions. Paul, apologies for the technical portion of it. And I want to thank Paul for, do you have any closing thoughts or anything before we let folks know where they can find the other webinars and remind them to give feedback and thank them?
Well, first off, thanks for letting me know via the questions if you can or cannot hear me. I'm glad to be back. And I hope you found the information in the webinar helpful. I did want to just, I mentioned this throughout the webinar, but I do want to mention one more time that please take a quick look before you log off at that attachments and links section. Both of those NIST resources are there, but I've also posted some information on Aruba's remote access solutions, which I talked about in the first part of the webinar, and also a link to the Aruba security part of the website that talks a lot about our ClearPass family of solutions. So please take a moment to take a look at some of those resources, and I appreciate everyone's time today on the webinar.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And I'm getting some feedback through the questions now that we did lose audio for what probably amounted to about 40 seconds. So I apologize. It's a small percentage of the overall webinar, but we do apologize for that. So thanks, Paul. Thanks, everyone, for hanging in there. I do want to remind you, this is the sixth in our weekly Stay Connected webinar series, as I mentioned. This series is on business continuity, something all companies are facing now. We invite you to visit the arubanetworks.com homepage. This is where you'll find the webinars that we've done in the past and those that we are going to do. If you scroll to the bottom at arubanetworks.com, you click on the webinars link in the menu at the bottom of the page, and it's going to take you to the Watch Past Webinars on Demand section, or you can register for future webinars. So we appreciate that. I see some of you have already given us some feedback. Please do that. You'll be prompted to do so when we close things out here. Let us know why you rated us, what you did, what your rating would be or is on a scale of 1 to 5 stars. And we appreciate it, and it helps us improve these each time out. We feel we're getting better every time. So, again, thanks to Paul. We also want to thank you for attending. I'm willing to bet we're not the only company doing webinars during this challenging time, so we appreciate you taking your time to attend ours. Once again, my name's Anthony, and for my colleague Paul, this concludes today's webinar. Until next time, have a great rest of your day.